Mark Oppenheimer will address the need for South Africa's foreign policy to reflect the values in our constitution.
South Africa says, well, we thumb our noses at these international statutes. And for a number of years took the view that South Africa should withdraw and wanted to encourage other African nations to withdraw from the ICC. For a strange purported reason, the idea that the International Criminal Court persecutes Africans by spending time prosecuting the worst offenders. It's a very strange line to have. Imagine if people said, well, you're persecuting Yugoslavians or Germans when you set up special tribunals like the Nuremberg Tribunal or the Tribunal Yugoslavia. You'd say, no, you're fighting for the rights of the victims of those evil regimes. And so that's the purpose of an international criminal court, is to hold dictators and war criminals to account for the horrible crimes that they performed against their citizens. And in many recent years, those citizens have been African. And so South Africa takes this odd stance on that front. So what are the fundamental principles in the South African Constitution that could be this light onto other nations? Well, freedom, dignity, and equality are our foundational norms. The other one that's often neglected in Section 1 of the Constitution is this value of non-racialism. And what that means is not just the prohibition on racism, but it's this more fundamental idea that when we assess each other, we do so based on the content of our characters, not the color of our skin, drawing from Martin Luther King's famous line. And this is undoubtedly a value that's important and one that has been swiftly abandoned by the ANC domestically, and I'd say abroad as well. One of the other fundamental rights for any democracy to prosper is the right of property. And what we've seen is a sustained attack on our domestic constitutional rights to property, that the ANC has tried for many years to amend our constitution to allow the government to confiscate people's private property. Thankfully, that constitutional amendment has failed, but it also has international ramifications. One of the biggest trading partners for South Africa is the United States, and we benefit from AGOA, which provides preferential access to their markets. South Africa exports roughly 200 billion rands worth of goods to America. And if we were to erode our constitutional property rights protections, there's a very good chance that AGOA would have been cancelled for us, that we would no longer be a beneficiary of it. Furthermore, of course, it jeopardizes all of the American businesses and other European businesses who run in South Africa, that their property could very well be confiscated by the state. So our domestic concerns also play a role with regards to our international relations with other nations, and those are being jeopardized. So there's a sense here in which we can see that what's good on a pragmatic level, like fostering relations with our biggest trading partners, can also coincide with the human rights account of protecting property rights. One of the values closest to my heart and much of the work that I do is around free speech. And if we think how important this free speech right is, the ability of people with dissenting views to be able to express them without a concern that they're going to be jailed for it. If we think about the awful amounts of censorship that happened during apartheid, that it's an important value to be enshrined in our constitution, and one that's quite maximal in its protections. We have very few limitations on free speech in South Africa, one of which being hate speech. Now, in the international arena, when the United Nations had a resolution on this question about people being able to freely express their ideas and to engage in public protest of those ideas, South Africa abstained. So instead of endorsing the values that are in our constitution, South Africa decided not to endorse those values in the public arena. We were also one of the early nations to guarantee protections for the gay community. So if you look at Section 9 of our Constitution, which is the Equality Clause, it lists a number of groups which are given protection, and sexual orientation is specifically listed. We were the 5th country in the world to have gay marriage, and many other nations have followed our lead. But in the international arena, when there was a resolution to protect people from being victimized or subject to violence on the grounds of sexual orientation, instead of South Africa saying, this is an important value. This is something that we ourselves have driven, that we care about on a domestic level, and other countries ought to care about it too. Again, South Africa abstains. We also see that there's a sidling up to some of the most sinister regimes in the world. So regimes that are happy to practice torture, kidnapping of people, to suppress the rights of journalists or their citizens. We could reflect the values that are in our constitution. We have the right to dignity. We have the right to bodily integrity, which specifically talks about people not being tortured and how you have a right not to be tortured. Something which should be close to the hearts of many members of the ANC who were themselves tortured during the struggle against apartheid. But we find that when the UN calls for these nations to be condemned, South Africa sits back and does nothing about it. With regards to what's in the current ANC's foreign policy document, we get a sense of where the allegiances lie. The document says that unilateral sanctions against Iran, Syria, North Korea, Nicaragua, Russia, and Venezuela, and Cuba are perfect examples of the bullying conduct that is intensifying. In other words, these poor little nations who are being bullied, these are rogue nations. These are some of the most sinister nations one can think of. That if we think about the atrocities that are committed in North Korea, that the human rights record of Iran is utterly abysmal. That if you are gay in Iran, you are subject to being pushed off a building because of it. That the actions of Russia have become more and more sinister over time, and I will speak in some detail about the current war in Ukraine. And then, of course, if we think about Venezuela, instead of condemning what the Venezuelan government has done to its own people, remember that 2.5 million people were driven into exile because of their abysmal economic policies, that people are on the Maduro diet, which is a polite way of talking about losing 30 kilos because you can't eat. A crisis that has not just affected Venezuela, but neighboring countries who've had to absorb all those people who've been driven into exile. Instead of condemning that conduct, what the ANC government does is try and emulate it by changing our constitution in a similar manner to the amendment done by Chavez, allowing the state to have this power to confiscate property. With regards to Cuba, again, a communist nation which has oppressed its people, which has one of the lowest access to internet in the world, which had a single dictator for a long period of time. The South African attitude towards it is to say, my friends, can we give you money? We know that our people are starving. We know that we can't pay our own social grants, but we'd like to give you 50 million rand. And of course, it takes an organization like AfriForum to take them to court to halt the payment of South Africa's funds to this regime. And how does the ANC regard what happened in Venezuela? Well, through a very strange lens. Again, in their policy document, they say, imperialist designs also continue to manifest in support of the right wing in Latin America. Nowhere is this felt more brutally than in Venezuela, whose economy has been wrecked through a combination of sanctions and sabotage, further deepening internal weaknesses and contradictions. This has led to a sharp rise in inflation, poverty, and hunger. So instead of confronting the reality that it's Venezuela's own domestic policy which led to the suffering, the claim is, well, it's those evil imperialists in the West who've imposed sanctions. And that's why things have gone south in Venezuela. Now, interestingly, one of the tools in the ANC's arsenal in the fight against apartheid was a call for sanctions against the apartheid regime. But now that it's in power, it has voted with Russia, Venezuela, and Saudi Arabia to oppose the use of economic sanctions by one state against another. So what's good for the goose isn't good for the gander. That instead of saying there are certain principles that are important to use, that being able to coerce a state into treating its citizens with dignity, with fairness, with freedom, and that sanctions are a useful way of encouraging that, South Africa says, no, we don't support that. Closer to home, when sanctions would have been quite useful in dealing with the atrocities committed by the Mugabe regime against the citizens of Zimbabwe, South Africa adopted a quiet diplomacy approach. This idea, well, we were brothers in the liberation movement, and we shouldn't be too harsh against what you're doing to your own people. Now, if we think about, again, the erosion of property rights in Zimbabwe, it didn't just affect the farmers who lost their land. It affected all citizens. That Zimbabwe is on the record for having the world's worst case of hyperinflation. That it was cheaper to use Zimbabwean notes than to go and buy toilet paper. That 90% of people were driven into unemployment. We think our electricity situation is abysmal. In Zimbabwe, they have more time without power than with power. And of course, it's created an enormous refugee crisis. So many Zimbabweans seeking a better life fled that country and came to our country and have prospered. And of course, this has led to other tensions. So as we've entered into our own economic troubles, people are being scapegoated. And the people that are being scapegoated are often Zimbabwean. There are calls from South Africa First style parties saying that Zimbabweans must be forced to leave, that they're often persecuted. If we think about the number of xenophobic attacks that have happened in South Africa, people being burnt alive, people being tortured and killed. The South African government has been very poor about dealing with this crisis, often doesn't condemn xenophobic attacks in the right terms, and has created a climate which has often led to these divisions. So one might say, well, maybe South Africa just takes this view of saying, leave us out of it. We're just going to abstain generally. We're not going to make proclamations about what happened in other states. But that's not what we find. So there's one nation in particular who is often singled out for rebuke by the South African government. That's the nation of Israel. Not only has South Africa taken a avowedly pro-Palestinian stance, which may be defensible, it has specifically invited Hamas to come to ANC conferences. Now, for those of you who don't know, Israel is on one side has the Gaza Strip and on the other side has the West Bank. The PLO, or the Palestinian Authority, are in the West Bank, and Hamas are in Gaza. And Hamas are widely regarded as a terrorist organization by the European Union, by America, by Australia. They are willing to specifically target civilians, launching rockets, kidnapping soldiers, are widely reviled as an organization, even by the Palestinian Authority. But the ANC government welcomed Hamas to South Africa, and we'll call them friends. It would even ruin the life of a young black South African girl who won Miss South Africa, who was invited to participate in Miss World, which happened to be held in Israel. And they condemned her, and they tried to force her not to go to Israel. And she defied them. She said, this is an important thing that I want to do. And she went to Israel and she competed in Miss World, and I think she came third. And there was a backlash against the ANC for saying, why are you taking your hatred for Israel out on this poor young girl, this girl who represents South Africa in a world forum? South Africa has downgraded its embassy with Israel. It's condemned Israel's observer status in the AU, and often out of kilter with what's been happening in the international arena with Israel. So if we think about the Abraham Accords, Israel has managed to do peace deals with many of its former adversaries, to great gain for those nations. That those nations that signed up to the Abraham Accords were often the fastest to provide vaccines during the COVID crisis. That Israel, being a small state, has incredible technological abilities. So South Africa has missed out on getting access to desalination plants, which would have been incredibly useful during the water crisis in the Western Cape, when we got very close to a day zero, and is an ongoing crisis in the Eastern Cape, where people don't have water. And so these are eschewed. So one might say, well, there's something different about Israel. This is a country that, has disputed territories. Maybe the ANC just cares about occupied people, that they would denounce that. But of course, the ANC is silent on Tibet. That when Desmond Tutu invited the Dalai Lama out, someone who's a regarded as a champion of peace, he was denied a visa. That when the Chinese persecute a Muslim minority of Uyghurs, again, South Africa is silent. And of course, we must then think about the current conflict, which has many ramifications for South Africa and the rest of the world. The conflict in Russia and Ukraine. Now, to her credit, Naledi Pandor came out very quickly, calling for Russian troops to be withdrawn from Ukraine. But this position was walked back. South Africa took the view that it wouldn't say something so harsh as that. The UN resolutions that were made, which South Africa abstained from, were signed up to by most nations in the world. They expressed grave concern for attacks on civilian facilities like schools and hospitals, the killing of women and children, people with disabilities. The UN recognized that the military operations in Russia inside the sovereign territory of Ukraine are on a scale that the international community has not seen in Europe in decades, and that urgent action is needed to save this generation from the scourge of war. Now, the question is, given the ANC approach to sinister regimes and sinister actions and its deviation from a human rights policy, can any of this be explained away by saying, well, this is what's in South Africa's pragmatic interest? I don't think so. I don't think that an ongoing war in Ukraine is good for South African citizens. As Nancy mentions, it's led to massive escalations in prices, inflation around the world, surging cost in fuel, which is going to be felt by the poorest of the poor the most strenuously. Why sidle up to Russia? Well, the ANC has had a friendly relationship with the Russians during apartheid, that many figures were trained in Russia. Jacob Zuma, when he believed that he was poisoned, flew out to Russia and believed that he was cured by Russians, that when we pursued nuclear, it was with the Russians. But as a trading partner with South Africa, Russia doesn't even fall into our top 25. It's less than a fraction of a percent. So in terms of South Africans on the ground, how important is our relationship with Russia? Not very important. It's important for the ruling party's prior loyalties. And so my argument is that instead of focusing on its prior loyalties, South Africa should first care about human rights